My name's Angela Flannery. I'm the president of the Australian Chapter of the International Institute of Communications. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting today, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. And I would also like to thank King & Wood Mallesons and Michael for making this lovely venue available to us today for the seminar. As most of you would know, the purpose of the IIC is to provide a forum to discuss policy issues that have a particular impact on the communications and digital sectors. So the IIC achieves this through holding events and seminars like the one we're holding today. The topic for today is focused on upcoming changes to the regulation of content in Australia, including whether we will have Australian content quotas for SVOD services, the regulation of interactive games, and also potential changes to Australia's anti-siphoning list. Our keynote speaker is Creina Chapman. Welcome, Creina, who is the Deputy Chair and CEO of the Australian Communications and Media Authority. Creina has extensive experience in the media and communications sectors, having, prior to her time at the ACMA, worked at a number of different media and communications companies, including Southern Cross Austereo and News Corp. So we look forward to hearing from Creina today. I also wanted to formally introduce the moderator of our panel, Michael Swinston from King & Wood Mallesons. Michael specialises in commercial transactions involving technology, intellectual property and data assets, and is an active thought leader on matters relating to privacy, data governance, cybersecurity, big data, and the Internet of Things. So Michael will introduce each of our great panellists when we get to the panel discussion. You should all know we're recording Creina's initial presentation, and so that will be available on the IIC website in due course. But for the panel discussion afterwards, that's definitely Chatham House rules. It won't be recorded, so please remember that. And with that, I'll hand over to Creina for her keynote presentation. Thanks, Creina.
Thank you, Angela. I also would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us here today. I first start by saying this is a very, very broad topic. I did stop at one stage and thought, actually, did it say Australian content regulation? But I realise it doesn't. It is Australia's content regulation. So in some ways, my remarks are somewhat random. I do with Australian content. They're a bit random, but they're a bit designed on who we have on the panel. So there are a lot of issues which I won't be covering. I won't touch on. But maybe that's something for questions, discussions. So just short of 6 months ago, the Honourable Michelle Rowland addressed an IIC and camera event, and I think looking around the room, I think a number of us were at that event that night, and she outlined the government's media reform priorities. She looked at immediate, short, long-term priorities, and a lot of work's been done under that framework, and this is still a lot underway. And she said that night that with significant upheaval in the market, changes are needed. So media markets continue to provide the services that are so valued by us as individuals and as a community. But changes means that existing areas of regulation need to be modernised, and there are new regulatory issues, new ones we need to start tackling. And just two examples that I've come up with, but there are others. The first is regulating prominence of local television services and smart TVs, and that was one of the immediate priorities that she listed, and that's well underway. Another is AI, which has become the issue du jour. You can't go anywhere without reading something, hearing something. Everybody's talking about it. Certainly, the emergence of generative AI technology in particular, we need to look at new ways to regulate. Some of our existing ways of regulating will work, but we are going to need new ways. While they do bring significant potential of benefit to consumers, but also to the economy and to our industry and the media communication sector, We all know that they bring heightened risks of harms, and particular focus things that we're looking at right now are particularly scams and misinformation. And also it raises questions of content ownership, and this might have possible implications for copyright law going forward. And I think, as most people here would know, the Minister for Industry and Science, Mr. Husick, put out a paper last week. His paper, Safe and Responsible AI in Australia, looks at regulatory and government responses here and overseas. It raises some of the potential gaps and it proposes several options to strengthen our framework. And that was accompanied by a very interesting paper, science paper. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but they're both well worth reading, and as I say, they're up for conversation. But there are so many content regulatory issues that remain the same. I was just saying to Matt beforehand, when I first entered the space 25 years ago, the first thing I heard about was anti-siphoning, and I didn't know how to spell it. Well, it's still there. It's still on the agenda, and the Minister is looking at the moment. Many of these issues, they're not new, but they need to be modernised. They need to be modernised for new business models, for new content delivery methods, and changing consumer habits. And so, recognising this need for modernisation, last year, in the middle of last year, we released a paper called What Audiences Want, which sets out our views of what safeguards Australian audiences expect when they're consuming media, regardless of where they're looking at it, or reading it or hearing it, regardless of whether it's online, in print, TV, or on radio. And we flagged suggested changes for the current licensed TV and radio operators, particularly given that we're in the process of largely starting of encouraging them to review their codes. But we also argued that new rules need to be developed for broadcasters to cover live streaming, catch-up, and on-demand services. And we also encourage streaming services and other online-only providers of professional content, and note that word professional because that was important, should take note of audiences' expectations that we'd highlighted. And we encourage them, when they're looking at their own community guidelines in terms of service, to take those into account. One of the areas, in fact, the first area we address in that paper is accuracy and impartiality of news and current affairs. And we also briefly touch on the related issue of misinformation in that section. So I think we all know that traditional safeguards in this area are sitting in self-encoded regulatory codes across the traditional media. They generally apply to journalists, media organisations. And to a large extent, and they have been successfully doing this, they are translatable online. Journalism is journalism, wherever it is. But we're seeing new additional factors now coming from online, which make it quite a different challenge. We know that digital platform intermediaries are sitting there processing content to some extent. They're not necessarily creating the content, but in some ways their algorithms are playing the role of the editor and often the amplifier. And we're seeing new harms that come out of this, and it's needing a different regulatory approach. So to that end, we oversee and monitor Digi's misinformation and disinformation voluntary code of practice. And as many of you would know, the government is currently working on new powers for us to hold the digital platforms to account in both of those aspects. Another area of considerable community concern is gambling. This has really escalated in its amplification in the past months and years, I guess. And this plays quite strongly into the content sphere. We at the ACMA, not many people sort of content space realise this, and not many people think of gambling as content, but it is. We're seeing quite a ramp up of our enforcement against both onshore and offshore illegal interactive online gambling services, and later in the year there'll be an online ban on credit betting. And as we all know, the current restrictions in relation to gambling advertising on television, radio and online are all being strongly debated, and especially by the current House of Reps committee into online gambling and its impacts. But also of interest, there's quite a focus that's been coming up lately in relation to simulated social gambling online. And the Minister recently put out a paper consulting on proposals for minimum R18 plus classifications for games which contain simulated gambling, which, if you're not familiar with that, it's basically social casino games, but you don't play them for money. And so therefore they don't fall within the Interactive Gambling Act because there's no money exchanged. and minimum M classifications for computer games which have loot boxes, which are things that can be purchased in-game or other purchases which are linked to charts. Example that people give often is in-play guns or in-play weapons, if you own. And the House of Reps in that area has also raised the question about whether or not they should actually fall within the definition of prohibited gambling services. And lastly, I'll get to the issue that everybody is so interested in at the moment, the big hot topic in our little, in our world, in our regulatory world, not new but hot, Australian content. So as we all know, the current debate is about how to extend the regulation to new products and in particular streaming video on demand. So to assist in framing this new regime and to assist the debate, which I should say the new regime is due by the middle of next year, we collect extensive data. We've been doing that for a number of years and we've been adding on to it as time goes on. At a high level, our most recent data, we did release the free-to-air expenditure data quite recently. It tells us a story which is not surprising, but that commercial free-to-air television and SVODs spend their money very, very differently. But this is not surprising given they're very different products and very different business models. So in 2021-22, the commercials spent $1.5 billion, but this was predominantly on sport, Australian sport, light entertainment, which is reality, and news and current affairs. And SVOD spent 335, which for maths was better, but it's totally different spend. Most of it, 200 million of that was on Australian drama. Now, note that common Australian drama. So to enable direct comparisons to be made between the sectors, we specifically use the same definition for all sectors. So we made it quite clear to the streamers that we would be collecting data based on the definition that is used by the free-to-airs and by subscription television. So what's known as the ACCTS test, a creative control test. Unsurprisingly, there's considerable ongoing debate about what the most appropriate definition for Australian is in regulation. Clearly, different definitions will provide you different outcomes, really, on a sliding scale of Australianness, if that is a term which is real. It's very hard to pin down. But it's one that rests very much on sometimes subjective, but often, a political. What is your objective? Is it a cultural or an economic combination, a contribution, or is it both? And what are the balances that you give to those values? So to give visibility to other streaming spend in Australia, to other contributions that they're making to the market, we also collected and reported on a separate bucket of spend referred to as Australian-related programs. This comprised all the other Australian spend on programs that didn't meet the regulatory definition. We basically said, if you meet at least one element, then it can fall in that bucket. And that was a deliberate thing. It was deliberately that under a voluntary system that we should show exactly what contribution, wherever it is coming from, whatever the type of Australian program it is coming from the SVOD. And programs that fit within that category in the past have been Pieces of Her, Nine Perfect Strangers, and Secrets of the Octopus, which I haven't seen, but I'm quite interested in that one. But I think just a last point on this, it's interesting to note that in the most reporting season, SVODs reported $308 million on these Australian reported programs. And that was for 14 commissioned and co-commissioned programs, which was almost as much as they spent on Australian programs, which was $335 million. So they're quite, you can see that we're talking here about 50-50 within the market. And I think it's sort of interesting information as we go into the debate about where this regulation is going. And ultimately, the definitions and any other elements of this new regulation frame that's going to dictate what's the impact on the production industry. What's the impact, obviously, on the streamers, but what's the impact on the other players within the market, the other people that are regulated after content, and most importantly, how consumers will they be impacted? What content are they going to get, and how are they going to get it? So, in years gone by, and this is me doing a reminiscing 25 years ago thing, when we had a limited number of broadcasters, we had a few broadcasters, they all had basically the same model, and they had a largely static static business model, and we also had subscription on the side. So setting up an Australian content regime was reasonably straightforward, and once it was set in place, it's sat in place for quite a long period of time with relatively few tweaks. It's like, should you get more points for having an extra half an hour on a program? You get so many for an hour, but if you do a mini series, you get 2 extra points. That was like revolutionary. It was the biggest change in 4 years. Wow. But today's challenge is completely different to that. Today is how is regulation framed that delivers both the cultural and the economic objectives, but also remains effective over time, and particularly as markets and consumers evolve. We've got a very dynamic, evolving environment, and whatever is set in place now will necessarily need to be considered, both for the SVOD industry and the market more generally, but also for regulation for the rest of the industry. Does this mean that within a few years' time we need to look at all of them again? Do we need to look at the free-to-air? Which ones do we need to look at? I mean, we're in a totally different world now. It does my head in whenever I think about it. We've got local players, we've got international players, we've got international players that own free-to-airs, we've got free-to-airs that own streamers, we've got subscription companies that have streaming products and have YouTube channels, which in one case I think is more popular than their linear channel. Then we've got the linear terrestrial television, we've got BVODs, we've got AVODs, we've got fast channels. We have many, and there are many more, and there will be many more to come. That's the point. How do you craft regulation now that works in the future as this changes? So this Australian content debate. It's traditionally been very divided. It's really been like us and them. I think I'm hoping that is not as much as it has been in the past, given that the industry is far more complex and diverse than it has been in the past. But I do hope that with goodwill and cooperation between everybody, and a lot of work by everybody to understand everybody else's position and where they're coming from, that hopefully the result will be effective regulation that delivers for all. I can't say an end result of effective regulation, because there is no end result. It's a constant moving job that we all have to keep moving. So I will leave it there and pass to you.